So the name Mawangdui may not be familiar to as many of you as names like Pompeii or Herculaneum or names from Western archaeological sites. But the site of Mawangdui is really, I believe, the most important archaeological excavation in the 20th century in China. More so than the terracotta warriors from Xi'an. Let me tell you why I say that. The terracotta warriors are an amazing fabrication, amazing production, but the tomb itself, the site itself, has yielded very little so far, especially since the main tomb mound itself will probably never be excavated in our lifetime. But this find from Mawangdui, these three noble tombs, have yielded what I call in this lecture a window onto ancient China. They actually give you a picture of the whole society, many aspects of the society. So in that way, it's much like a Pompeii or Herculaneum, or say a tomb of King Tut, the only unplundered old Egyptian tomb, or let's say the pre-classical Mayan village of Seren in El Salvador, which was buried by a volcano and gave you this picture of pre-classical Mayan life. So because it's this unplundered and perfectly preserved set of tombs, I call it the window onto ancient China because it gives you this kind of unpondered look onto the ancient past. Now, since these were excavated in the 1970s, it's become an entire branch of study. It's much like, let's say, Dead Sea Scrolls studies or Dunhuang studies. It's an entire branch of study, Mawangdui studies. And there have been thousands of books and tens of thousands of articles published concerning the finds from this site. And there are hundreds of graduate students in the U.S. and China still working on dissertations and books related to the finds from Mawangdui. And the finds still aren't all published. Many of them were published in the 70s, but some are still coming out. And there's probably a good 20 or 30% which have still not yet been published. So this is a tremendous work in progress of Mawangdui studies. But for studying ancient China, especially the 3rd and 2nd century BC, this site is primary document number one. Any student who wants to know anything about ancient China has to first familiarize themselves with this site. Okay, so let me give you some of the historical and archaeological background, then I'll talk about the excavation a little bit, and then give you an overview of some of the finds. So the site itself is located in the outskirts of Changsha in southern China in Hunan province. And this is a diorama which you can find at the museum there, showing the two mounds of a horse saddle-shaped hill known as Mawangdui, which had the burials of these three individuals. Now, I need to give a little bit of historical background so we know who these individuals are. The Han Dynasty was founded in 202 BC by a man named Liu Bang, and Liu Bang was originally a peasant. He joined the uprising against the Qin Dynasty and eventually betrayed one of his cohort to take the throne and found the next dynasty after an extensive civil war. Now, after the Civil War was over in 202 BC, he did not have control of the entire country, nor the military power to control the entire country as the first Emperor Qin had done. So he enfeoffed his relatives, sons, brothers, nephews, with large pieces of territories, feudal kingdoms. But he also enfeoffed 7 men who were not members of his family in large pieces of territory. And one of these men, named Wu Rui, was king of Changsha, the kingdom of Changsha. As I mentioned, Changsha down here in the south. So this was a large piece of territory which went from Changsha to, let's say, the border near Guangdong province down here. So it was a very large kingdom. But it was also very poor. It was a malarial region. The whole population was under 100,000. And we have contemporary documents, some of which I've been translating recently, of this particular individual here complaining to the capital, you know, we don't have any horses here. The horses all died. Can you please send some more horses? The king can't even ride in his carriage. We need more horses. So this wasn't the most popular place to go. Less than 100,000, a very poor province, but it was located in a very strategic place. It was located on the border with an independent kingdom down here called Nanyue, or pronounced Nam Viet, or Vietnam. which was an offshoot of a general from the Qin dynasty who rebelled, founded his own kingdom down here, which controlled what's now Canton into Vietnam. And they were at war with China, basically. They were trying to smuggle iron out of China for weapons. They claimed to have an emperor who was also the son of heaven. And so there needed to be a defense. There needed to be a buffer against this southern power. And that was the strategic importance of Changsha. So it was found, when these tombs were excavated, that the occupant of the western mound was a man named Li Tang. And this was the proof. There were two bronze and one jade seal in the tomb, which mentioned his name, Li Tang, and the fact that his noble title was Dai Ho, or Marquis of Dai, and that he was prime minister of this kingdom of Changsha. And so, looking through historical records, it was found that yes, indeed, a person named Li Tang was enfeoffed as Marquis of Dai in 193 and died in 186, and he was the prime minister of this state of Changsha. And so he's the individual who's buried in Tomb 2 in the Western Mound. Now, Tomb 2 was plundered multiple times. It was plundered in antiquity, probably in the 7th century AD. It was plundered in the 20th century as well. So very little was left of tomb number 2, except for those seals and some pottery. Now, then there were 2 tombs in the Eastern Mound as well. Tomb number 1 was the first discovered, and I'll talk a little bit about the excavation. That was found in 1972. And there's another tomb next to it, found shortly after that, and excavated in 1973 and 1974. Now, tomb number 3 has a date. It has a document in it that says, the Chamberlain of the House of Dai submits these items to the Lord of the Underworld for review. And it's dated 168 BC. So we know this man died in 186, and this person died in 168. Now, it's standard in this time period for a husband and wife to be buried in an Eastern and Western tomb like this. So it's assumed that the person buried here, this female, which we'll learn a lot more about, is the wife of Li Tang. But because this particular tomb sort of spilled over onto this tomb, we know that it's latest. That this was dug in 168, and this was dug after it because it spilled sort of over onto this tomb. So we know that this is Li Tang, this is probably his wife, whose name we actually don't know, and this was probably their son. He was buried basically at the foot of his mother. This would be her feet here, so he was sort of buried at the foot of his mother. And he predeceased her. He was a man probably in his 20s or 30s based on the skeleton in his tomb, and she was in her early 50s. Okay, the excavation in 1972 was sort of an accident. It was known for hundreds of years that there were tombs here. We have ancient records saying that, yes, there's some sort of burial here. Maybe it's a king from the 11th century. Other people thought maybe it's a Han Dynasty prince's mother and one of his wives. But it wasn't until 1972 when the People's Liberation Army was, for their hospital, was digging an underground room in the hospital, which is next to this mound. And they breached the outer wall of tomb number 1. And a big burst of methane gas came into the tunnel and lit on fire. A big blue flame. And they immediately called the archaeologists because they knew what that meant. That tombs from this southern region were so well packed, airtight, that when the organic material decomposed, it produces methane, which doesn't escape. And that when you breach these tombs, the fire can blast out. And there are ancient records of hundreds of people actually getting killed when they were plundering or opening an ancient tomb and having a big blue flame come out and hit them. So they called in the archaeologists, but this was during the Cultural Revolution. This was a time in which the 4 olds were being destroyed by Red Guards and others. Yet this find was so important that people at the highest levels of state decided to protect it and send the archaeologists there. Some of the archaeologists were actually in labor camps, and they were taken out and sent to work at this site. And the Premier of State, Zhou Enlai, personally wrote a letter signifying that this was an important excavation and that the People's Liberation Army had to help, and all these archaeologists needed to work on this because this was their King Tut's tomb. This was their chance for a beautiful unplundered tomb, which would show the glories of ancient China. So this is a cutaway of tomb number 1, which is the most fully reported today. This is the mother's tomb. We'll call her Lady Tomb. So it's 20 meters deep. It's a good 20 meters deep. And there's steps leading down. I can show you the similar layout of her son's tomb, tomb number 3. These are rammed earth. It's pounded as hard as concrete, but it's made of rammed earth. And this is a ramp at this side where things are brought down. But the tomb itself is way down the bottom. So at the bottom of this 20-meter pit, they put a layer of timbers, and then some charcoal, and then some tight white clay, and then they built an enormous wooden house down here, which was then surrounded by tons of charcoal, followed by a meter thick of white clay. So this was airtight and watertight, mostly. He was actually under the water table and still kept out most of the water for 2,000 years. This is what the excavated outer house looks like in the museum today. And some of these timbers are enormous. They count the rings. They're over 600 years old trees, most of these. Some of these timbers weigh more than 2,000 pounds for the largest timber. So a huge timber house was built at the bottom of this pit. And this is what it looks like from above. From above, we can see there's a northern chamber, southern, eastern, and western chamber, and in the central coffin chamber. And you can see these timbers all connected with mortises and tenons, no nails used. So I'm going to go through a little bit the contents of the tomb and tell you about the different chambers and what was in them. And so here's a cutaway. And so the first place we'll go is the northern chamber over here. So this is what the northern chamber looked like in excavation. You can see a little bit of water in this stuff. The northern chamber represents the living quarters of Lady Di. The whole model is based on a house. It's based on a noble residence. And so the place where she would be eating and being entertained is the northern chamber. And so what we see here is a dais for her to eat. There are pillows here, there are fans, the walls are covered with silk hangings, there are mats on the floor. This is actually her cane, her walking stick, laying at her side. She has a makeup case right here, which I'll show you in a little bit, with all of her makeup and mirrors in it. And for her lap, there is a whole tray full of a meal, full of meat. Mostly here you see the skewers, chopsticks over here, both cold and warm fermented grain beverages here. And these are her serving figures. These are wooden figurines, many with real clothes, which are representing servants, dancers, singers, those who are entertaining her while she eats. Her son's tomb had a very similar northern chamber, but in his northern chamber, there were weapons and a chess set and all the things that represented his masculinity, the things that represented him. For her soul, if you follow many of the ancient texts, was divided into 2 parts. There was the poor soul, the corporeal soul, which resided in the tomb, in the body. So the body needed to be preserved. As long as the body existed, that soul had a home. That soul would leave the body and would come here to eat. So it needed to recognize its home. The other soul was lighter than air. It would float up and it would go to heaven. And I'll show you a representation of that lifting up to heaven later. So the part of her soul that stayed in the tomb would be here. And here we see a close-up view of that dais here. Here's her carrying stick, walking stick there. This is the tray, the lacquer tray, which is in this exhibit, and many of these pieces are these beautiful lacquers, and I'll talk about the lacquers in a little bit. And here are some of those figurines from the North Chamber. Now let me go briefly to the Eastern Chamber. The Eastern Chamber was like the kitchen. This was like the kitchen area. Here we have dozens of lacquer vessels, food vessels, vessels for wine. Many of them, of course, were full of the actual food. And I'll talk about food in a little bit. And we have a round carafe that's in the exhibit. There's also a square, large carafe for this fermented grain beverage. And we have many more serving figurines. many more kitchen staff, maids, and servants. These are all females with clothing painted on them, very similar to the embroidered textiles in the exhibit. Now, in the western chamber, as you see off to the side, was the storage facility. This is where we have dozens of bamboo boxes full of clothes, full of meat, full of grains, and 40 baskets full of fake money. However, why fake money? This is over 100,000 fake coins, gold coins and bronze coins in fake clay. Well, these people weren't poor. These people had an enormous amount of money. Just the lacquers in their tomb would have cost, the yearly income of thousands of people. But they're buried with fake money because you can't use real money in the afterlife. It's recognized that the figurines are your servants. They're actually sometimes modeled on real people that work in your household. But the real people can't be buried in the tomb because human sacrifice is illegal. Plus, real people rot, but figurines don't. And so real money wouldn't work down here. You have to have money made of the earth because it's going to be used under the soil. That's why rich people are buried fake money. Now, the central portion of the tomb are the nested coffins. So there are 4 coffins overall, and here they are being peeled away. There's an outer plain black coffin, and the 4 coffins represent her rank. She's the wife of a lord. They're entitled to 4 nested coffins. Her son only had 3 nested coffins. He was not a lord. He did not succeed to the lordship of the Marquis of Dai. That was his brother. So that's one of the reasons we know that he wasn't the successor to that. So the outer plain coffin, and then 3 inner coffins. A reproduction of the red one is in the show, so you can get a kind of idea of the size of it. The black one is a large one was next, and it's painted with beautiful designs of clouds and these immortal spirits dancing and running throughout the clouds, killing evil spirits. Because evil spirits are always trying to eat your soul. They're trying to get in the tomb, and these guys with the weapons here are going to kill the evil spirits that are trying to eat your soul. And here's a close-up of one of these immortal spirits. And so this really represents the kind of mythology and religion you see in the South in the Han Dynasty. Inside that is the red coffin, the one that's in the exhibit. And it's painted with auspicious symbols and animals, and the side of it shows the mountain where the immortals live. So this is a kind of vision of paradise that the person inside the inner coffin might want to see in her inner world. So it's kind of like a microcosm in her coffin. Now within that is a fabric-covered coffin. This had fabric and feathers attached to the outside. The feathers all decayed away. The brocade fabric is still remaining. Inside, on top of that, was the famous tea banner. And the tea banner is also in the exhibit, which was lying on top of the coffin, facing down, meaning it was for her to see inside the coffin and to give her guidance on her trip to heaven, at least for the soul that goes up. So let me start to go through a few themes here, and let's talk about those funerary banners first. In the documents from the tomb, they're called flying clothes. We'll call them funerary banners. And like I said, it was found on top of the inner coffin facing down. And I'm going to take you through the 3 parts of this banner and then compare it to the one found in her son's tomb. The bottom portion of this tea banner, you have this kind of Atlas figure, this large man here, holding up the living world. And he's standing on some kind of Leviathan creature down here, kind of underwater creature, holding up the world. Well, what's going on here in the terrestrial world? We see a bunch of people standing around ritual bronze vessels. There's some blue vessels up here, and here is a coffin. This is a fabric-covered coffin. This coffin is her coffin. This represents her in the tomb. And so that's here in the lower level. Then we go up to the next level of the painting here. We see a jade ring here, which represents the passage to heaven, because heaven is round in Chinese cosmology. And we see a sort of platform. I call this like the heaven elevator. This is how she is going up. And we have Lady Di herself. She's leaning on a cane. That's the cane that was found in her tomb. And she's hunched over, and I'll tell you why she's hunched over in a little bit. She has 3 servants on her right and 2 servants on her left. And she's about to go through this lid here and pass up into heaven. This is the top of the banner. We have the sun and the moon. In Chinese cosmology, the sun is inhabited by a black crow, and the moon is inhabited by a frog and a rabbit. The frog and the moon. And the rabbit possesses the elixir of immortality, is the myth. These are the gatekeepers. These are the ones who control whether your soul is supposed to be up in heaven or not. And these are thought to represent either suns or stars in the sky. Now, there's some problems with the identification of the 2 female figures in this painting. There's a woman up here who has the body of a woman and the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a snake. And there's another woman over here who's riding a dragon up to the moon. Now, we could read this as Lady Di, whose soul has finally reached heaven. Because we can see a little bit of resonance here. We have 3 servants on the right, 2 on the left. If you look at, there are 3 birds to her right and 2 birds to her left. Maybe these are her servants who have been transformed into birds to serve her in heaven, and this is her immortal spirit. But she also might be this person here, this one riding a dragon. There's plenty of other imagery showing an immortal spirit riding to heaven on the body of a dragon. Other people think this is another female figure from mythology who stole the elixir of immortality and took it to the moon and turned into the frog. Okay, we have a little bit of cross-check we can do on this because we have a banner from both tombs. We have Lady Di's banner here. And there we have Lady Di. And her son's tomb also has a banner. And so the central portion in the son's tomb, we also have a portrait. This is the son. And he's carrying a sword and he has a military guard. So this is his signifier. And if we look down, we also see the funerary banquet that he's having down here. And here's his fabric-covered coffin down here. So if we go up to heaven, here we see there's the gatekeepers again. And back up a little bit. If we go up to heaven here, we see that the painting is not in as good a condition. Let's go up to heaven here on Lady Di's. So if we compare these 2 paintings with heaven, we see the similarities. We see here's the moon and the frog, here's the crow and the sun, and here's the lid, here's the gatekeepers. But there's no woman over here. There's no woman riding a dragon going to the moon. So maybe this woman does represent Lady Di going over here. But we can't see the central figure here. There is a person who's half person and half snake here, but it's so destroyed, you can't tell if it's a man or a woman. So that would solve the mystery of what these figures represent here. But it's definitely the underworld, the earthen world, and heaven, and represents a transformation of the spirit on its way to heaven. I'm sure I stay out of time here. Okay, let's talk about textiles. Both tomb number 1 and tomb number 3 yielded dozens of beautifully preserved silk textiles. And there's a beautiful robe in the exhibit. This is a similar one. Lady Di herself was covered in 20 layers of clothes on top of her body. Her son was as well. Hers were in perfect condition because the body was preserved. His not in such a good condition. Others were stored in the bamboo boxes in the western chamber. We have every kind of silk you can imagine. Embroidered silk, gauze silk, satin silk, printed silk, painted silk. There was one box full of 60 different rolls of fabric of different types. And these are over 2,000 years old, beautifully preserved, as you'll see in the exhibit. Including 3 pairs of silk mittens found in her makeup box with embroidery here on it. And this is another piece which I believe is also in the exhibit. This is embroidery over brocade. And you can see the threads, the dyed threads. But if you look in the background, you can see that there's actually a pattern, a brocaded pattern woven into the silk. The Chinese invented the brocade loom. This is something that the French thought they invented many centuries later. The Chinese invented the jacquard or brocade loom thousands of years ago. And it involves changing the weft and work threads to actually weave a pattern into the background, a picture pattern. One of the other revelations is printed textiles, actually using printing blocks to repeat the same pattern. And there are several examples from this site. This one is printed in gold and silver, paste out of real gold and silver, and printed on this textile. And of course, the Chinese invented printing. They invented printing of books. And they even invented movable type hundreds of years before Gutenberg. But they invented printing on textiles long before that. Now, another find found in the 1980s in that kingdom of Mawangdui in the south, they actually found a real printing block for printing textiles. This is made of bronze and would be used to print almost this exact same pattern. So they know that this was repeatedly stamped over the silk from a block looking very similar to this. Now, sometimes you have both printed and painted. This is an example of a silk where the background pattern was printed, and then you have several layers of paint of different colors to give you the details in white, in blue, and red accents on top of the printed background. Now, the thing that excites historians the most is texts. And tomb number 1 did not reveal very many texts. But tomb number 3, that of Lady Di's son, revealed an enormous library of texts, one of the most amazing lost libraries ever found. This is equivalent, like I said, to the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was a huge library of books completely forgotten or not even heard of before. They were found in one box. There was a box in the eastern chamber of his tomb, and this box contained some scrolls here in this long chamber, and in another chamber where dozens of books on silk were folded up and put all together. And later, these had to be taken apart little bit by little bit, and it's taken 3 decades to publish some of these texts because they were in such deteriorated condition. But it's yielded a huge cache of knowledge. Knowledge of philosophy, astronomy, history, all sorts of military knowledge we didn't have before. The thing that excited a lot of people were copies of the Tao Te Ching, copies of the Lao Tzu. In fact, 2 copies in this tomb. And they were copied at different times. Copy A is older, it's an older style of calligraphy, goes back maybe somewhere between maybe 205 and 195 BC. Copy B is a little bit later. It dates from maybe 195 to 180 BC. And they're very different than the current copy of the Lao Tzu, or the Tao Te Ching, the classic of Taoism. They put the De before the Tao. They switched the 2 sections, and they're also not divided into chapters like the modern text. And they're different in many specific words and phrases. So people who study Taoism, Chinese philosophy, have toiled for many, many years discussing these different editions and what new knowledge of the Taoist classics they can gain from them. There are also some historical texts, like this particular text here. This is part of the text of the Warring States period, the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, and all the different stratagems of the philosophers who gave military advice to the different rulers. And we knew about many chapters of this book because Sima Qian used them to construct his great history of China. But there were at least 16 chapters found in this tomb which have been lost for thousands of years, and we now have because of this text. One of the things that's most exciting to me is the oldest maps in the world. The oldest maps on silk, the oldest color maps, and this is the oldest map made from a real survey that exists in the world. The map represents the territory between the Changsha Kingdom and Canton. This is Canton Harbor up here, and the Changsha Kingdom is up here. This is the border region. This is that dangerous DMZ between the Changsha Kingdom and the Kingdom of Mawangdui. And I have this map hyperlinked so we can go to some of these sites. So this map mentions dozens of towns and nearly 100 different villages, and listing all the rivers, major towns, and small villages down to just a few hundred people. The government wanted to know where every single Chinese citizen was, so that in case of war, they could be called into the military and brought to the defense of the southern part of the empire. And I've always said that archaeologists should use this map to excavate a real village, because these rivers are still in these exact same positions. And this is only about 500 meters from this river to this river. And so they could actually excavate a real Han village if they used this map. It's that accurate. It's probably 90% accurate based on satellite photos. Okay, so the site has also yielded tremendous remains of food. And let me just read off some of the different types of food that we find in Tombs 1 and Tomb 3. So we have, in just Tomb 1, pig, goat, chicken, dog, duck, deer, rabbit, wild goose, crane, fish, partridge, quail, swan, heron, carp, bream, and dozens more. Many of these were cured or dried meats. There were also dozens of prepared dishes. They were stewed, fried, braised, and these are all listed in the inventory slips of the tomb. If you look at some of the remains, they're in remarkable condition. When they first opened the tomb, you can see bones of a lot of meat decay, but things like pears and stuff, you can still see the skin on the pears. I mean, it quickly turned black, but things like berries and pears were actually still intact in some of the baskets. And here you see some of the bamboo baskets, and you can see, in many cases, the food had rotted just to bones, but in other cases, you could still make out what kind of fruit it was. For grains, we had all the different grains, rice, millet, beans. There were also dates, plums, loquats, melons, pears, persimmons, and all sorts of grain beverages as well. Now, Lady Di apparently ate a lot of meat. Examination of her body, which I'll talk about in a little bit, revealed lots of plaques in her arteries. She had significant atherosclerosis. She died of a heart attack. And it's thought that maybe she ate too much meat. That entire meal laid out in front of her was all meat. It was all different kinds of meat. And she drank a lot of liquor to go with that meat. So she lived a very lavish lifestyle. But it could also be, as my student Musho, who's probably in the audience back here, has suggested, that her descendants also buried her with a lot of meat to show not only her status in life, that she was wealthy, but that they took good care of their mother and provided her with meat for the afterlife, as a good child should do. Okay, let's talk lacquer, because this exhibit is full of lacquer. We have these gorgeous lacquer vessels. This is a Ming vessel, a food tripod, which is in this show. And this tomb represented the greatest find of lacquer to date. Hundreds of lacquer, 184 from Tomb 1, over 300 from Tomb 2. Most of them food and drinking vessels, but also chest sets and shields and crossbows, other things like that. Now, lacquer itself, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the process of lacquer. You start with a wooden core, you polish it down, you cover it with a layer of raw lacquer, which is a sap from a particular tree. Then you polish it, you coat it with another layer of lacquer, you polish that, coat it with another layer of lacquer, polish that, over and over again, from as little as 5 to as many as 500 times to get a really good coating. Most of these lacquers were probably 5 to 10 layers. But lacquer itself, you can really only grow it or cure it in this zone in China, because you need a high humidity, 75 to 85%, and a high temperature to cure the lacquer coating. And when it cures, it's actually a natural plastic. It's indistinguishable by chemical analysis from modern plastic. So it's waterproof, acid-proof, and it became the luxury dining material in ancient China. For silver plate for the Roman Empire, for China it was lacquer. Lacquer replaces bronze as the luxury ware. And lacquer was incredibly expensive. Think of the labor involved. And think of the chemicals like the mercury or the cinnabar that you need for the red pigment. So lacquer was a very labor-intensive product that was very expensive. Now, lacquer in China goes back 4,500 BC, the earliest lacquer bowl, Neolithic, Stone Age from China. This one here from the site of Mawangdui. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the style of lacquer and its evolution to see where this Mawangdui style comes from. This particular piece is from the 6th century BC. Now, if you look at the particular style here, it's the same as bronzes. Chinese ritual bronzes like you can see upstairs in the Asian gallery. These patterns here exactly imitate bronzes because bronze was the preeminent medium still. But in the Warring States period, that period from 450 to 220 BC, lacquer comes into its own and starts to develop its own design system. And the sources of that design system are various. First, it still draws on those old bronze patterns, but then it starts to pull from different directions. One is from textiles. As I'll show you in a little bit, the twill textiles, the kind that lead to diagonal patterns and lozenges, had a great influence on contemporary lacquer painting. This is from a tomb from 300 BC. The other influence on the Mawangdui lacquer style were embroidered textiles. And this is an embroidered textile from that same tomb, 300 BC. Embroidered textiles that have these dragon and tiger motifs. And the dragon motifs, here you see a head of a dragon, they branch out with claws and heads. They look like vines. In fact, they also look like clouds. And these kind of curling, weaving dragons become the cloud scrolls that you see on the Mawangdui lacquers. And the third influence is metal inlay on bronzes. If you look at metal inlay from around that same period, 4th to 3rd century BC, you'll see some of the diagonal patterns influenced from twill textiles. You see some of the more curvilinear features influenced from embroidered textiles, and then the kind of dual color aspect you get with the gold and silver inlay into bronze. So all of these are coming together and forming a system, a design system for lacquer. And here we see the formation of that system in the 3rd century BC. We can see the diagonal influence coming from the textiles. We see the curvilinear designs coming from the embroidery, and this kind of two-tone alternation coming from the inlaid bronzes. And so what that takes us to is Mawangdui. Mawangdui is the pinnacle. It's the synthesis, the height of this Warring States design system for lacquer, when all these different influences came together to lead to this style. And so we can see in the border the diagonals influenced from the twills. We can see the scroll patterns descended from those embroidered dragons. And so this all comes together on things like these huge lacquer platters you can see in the show. Okay, so we're still on schedule. Let's talk about Lady Di's body. Lady Di's body has attracted a lot of attention. This is what Lady Di looked like when they peeled back many of the layers of clothes and found her. She was wrapped, as I said, in 20 layers of clothes. But what shocked everybody was the fact that her tissues were still soft. And this is what she looks like there today. Her body had started to decay, and then it stopped. She lost about half her weight, and her brain had shrunk a little bit, but her organs were still soft, her connective tissue was still soft. They could still do an autopsy. They could examine the contents of her stomach and see that she had died. I don't need to leave that one up. If it creeps, we'll go back to this. She had died, they found, in this autopsy very suddenly. She had no bed sores or any indication that she had wasted away. She had coronary artery blockage, and she died in her early 50s. They determined that that wasn't the only thing that she had going on. We always make these assumptions that the people in the ancient world were like us. But actually, the people in the ancient world had a huge burden of disease. They put up with things that would lay us low. Even a rich person who lived a lavish lifestyle, who had such luxury and such wonderful food, she suffered tremendously. They determined that she had tuberculosis. She had large tubercles in all of her lungs. She had 3 different forms of parasites. She had schistosomiasis, including the eggs of it were still in her liver. She had tapeworms. She had pinworms. She had a collapsed disc in her back, which is why she hunched over and needed that stick. She had severe arthritis in all of her joints, and she had enormous gallstones that would have sent most people into horrible pain. And so this is a very rich woman who died in her early 50s and lived with all of this stuff, which is probably also why there's lots of medicine in her tomb. There's plenty of medicinal herbs and things to make her feel better. So why did the body not rot? This has been often compared to, let's say, Otzi, the Iceman, who was found on the Italian-Swiss border, or the Peabod men from Northern Europe. But this is not a mummy. It does not appear that it was intentionally mummified in any way. It's still soft. And her son's tomb, the son's body completely decayed. It was just down to the skeleton. And so why did her body not decay? Decay had started. The bacteria had started to take her over and then stopped. All the bacteria then died. And so her body was preserved. And so there's several theories regarding this. One has to do with the way the tomb was constructed. The layers of charcoal, the layers of clay, it kept out all the water and air, and so the aerobic bacteria could not get in. And then when all those plants and meat decayed, they created a lot of methane, and the methane would have killed all the other kind of bacteria, the anaerobic bacteria. It's also possible that there were 80 liters of a kind of acidic fluid found in her coffin. And this acidic fluid was probably not put there intentionally. It probably came from the silk fiber, from the surrounding fluids from her body, but somehow this fluid also inhibited the bacteria formation in her cadaver. And so her body survived to the point that it's now in the museum, floating in a vat of formaldehyde, with at least a little modesty cover there. Okay, so after we talk about death, let's talk about beauty for a little bit, and then I'll wrap up. Amazing pieces of the exhibit is her makeup box. This is Lady Di's makeup box. It's made of lacquer, and it's 2-level. There's a lower level which has 9 little boxes in it, and each of these are for a different kind of cosmetic or cosmetic appliance. The round ones have things like face powder, rouge, lipstick, eyeliner. The horseshoe-shaped boxes have combs in them, different fineness of combs for her hair. And the other boxes have things like hairpins. In the top layer, there was a bronze mirror wrapped in silk, as well as her mittens and eyebrow tweezers and things like that. And here we have a Han picture of what a woman would do if she put the mirror up in a stand and would make her toilet right here. And here's another one of those toilet boxes right next to her. These are some of the items that were found inside these boxes. Here are some of the fine combs. Here's a big lump of a makeup substance which still survives. Here's the brush for drawing in the eyebrows. Here's some tweezers. And for this exhibit, I did some special photography on one of these boxes that I wanted to experiment with for a second. Be patient for 1 second while this comes up. Now, I have a student who's writing a dissertation on these kind of makeup boxes. And what she has discovered is that the sense of beauty was the same for men and women. The ideal of beauty for the female was the same as for the male. It was flawless white skin. It was thick, luxurious black hair. The men spent as much time making themselves up as the women. Her son had a makeup box almost identical in his northern chamber. But he had certain manly things in his as well, like a writing brush and a writing eraser. But he had the same kind of makeup as she did. Now, she also has determined in her research that beauty and death were linked. But there's a reason that the makeup box is in the tomb. That the only way the soul will survive in the afterlife is if the body is preserved. And the way to preserve the body is to have it be beautiful. and to make it up, to make it look young. So makeup has to do with looking young again. And so the makeup would always be there in the tomb so that she could make herself up and stay young, so that her soul could survive in the tomb. And my student has showed how, over time, this concept had developed. They eventually put the makeup boxes directly in the coffin next to the body, not just in an outer chamber. And so this is one of the little boxes you'll see upstairs, and you'll see the same beautiful cloud scrolls on these boxes. Okay, so I think I've exactly hit my 45 minutes, and I want to thank you for coming to the lecture tonight.